Rockcliffe has always had kind of a special place in my heart and Danielle's as well. So when we were dating and I was at the Memphis School of Preaching and we would come back to visit Danielle's family, we would often worship here. And so my first interaction with the churches in Warren County was Rockcliffe. And I got to know some of the folks here, and then eventually came to preach here at Hebron in the area, and have been associated with this congregation. One of my good friends, Jeff Johnson, was preaching here when I first moved here. That's been several years ago now. And so I've always had a lot of fondness for this congregation, and I appreciate you all, and I appreciate you guys having me out to be a part of the VBS today. This topic, though, is a doozy. Brian texted me or called me a while back now and said, hey, would you come and speak to us? And you're going to have, at the time it looked like 3 hours, but really about 2 hours. And I want you to talk about what it would be like if Paul wrote a letter to the churches in Warren County. I thought, wow, that is a big topic. That's a lot to chew on. But it is something that I think it's important to examine the sort of the health and the state of the church at large in a county that is replete with churches of Christ. What does it look like? What is the atmosphere overall? And so that's what we're going to try to do this morning. What I thought I would do is approach it as if we were studying an epistle of Paul, right? If we were studying Philippians, for instance, we talk about the history of the city and the congregation. We would talk about, some of the things that the church is dealing with and addressing, and then we would talk about, some of the ways that applied individually, and then we'd get into the epistle itself. Well, that's sort of what we're going to do. Let me give some disclaimers first, okay? Let me sort of, tell you the first things that scared me as I thought about this. Number one, Paul presented both inspired truths and his opinion on occasion. I've got some instances in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 when it comes to marriage and the present distress. Remember, Paul said, it's better not to get married under the present distress. But he made clear that was his opinion. That was his judgment. Now, he added this. He said, but I think also that I have the Spirit of God. I do not have the spirit of inspiration. Okay? I'm not inspired by God. I am not an apostle. I am not Paul. And so when Paul said in 1 Corinthians 7:40, this is my judgment, but I think also that I have the Spirit of God. I can give you my judgment, but I don't have the Spirit of God. So that's going to be a difference. But I am going to give you both what I think is inspired truth relative to the churches in Warren County, and sometimes what is my opinion. And your opinion can differ. That's the beauty of opinions, right? Is that we can have them and we can talk about them. And so I wanted to make those things known as well. And then number three, I'm going to use the word church a lot as it relates to congregations, right? Now we know that there is one church, and we're going to talk about that. It's the church that Jesus died for. It is the body of Christ. We understand that. There's one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one body, right? Ephesians 4:4-6. We've got that. But the word church can be used to denote a congregation, right? Paul would often address the church at, okay? And so church can mean congregation just as it can mean the church. Also, I used to have a problem with this. People would say, my church. And they would especially ask me as the preacher, right, where's your church? And, if you want to be a kind of a smart aleck, then you can say, I don't have a church. I didn't die to purchase a church, which is absolutely true. And I've talked to people about that. Now, it might not be a good icebreaker. If somebody comes to you and Cracker Barrel and says, hey, where's your church? I don't have a church, And I think there's a way to have that discussion, and we need to have that discussion. But if we're talking about it in the sense of a congregation, is this your congregation? In a sense, it is. You've been here your whole life. Your whole life. So it is yours in that sense. You didn't purchase the church, but this congregation you feel some sense of connectivity and ownership. Paul used the phrase, my God, didn't he? My God. Now, he doesn't own God. What he's saying is there's a sense of connection and unity between him and God. There's a personal connection there. So, I understand it's not my church. It's not your church. It's the church that Jesus bought and paid for. Acts 20, verse 28. We recognize all of those things, but sometimes we say, welcome to, this is my congregation. And I think there's something to be said about feeling a sense of belonging somewhere. I really do. And so, we might use that language some, but we understand hopefully what we're talking about, and we'll address that as we get through. Am I fit to talk about this? Well, I don't really think so, because I'm not Paul. Okay, but I was assigned to this topic, and I do have some credentials to talk about it. I have been in Warren County in full-time ministry for 23 years. I've been in full-time ministry for 23 years. My entire time preaching full-time has been here in Warren County. And in fact, I was only a Christian for 3 years before I started preaching. I grew up in Dyersburg, Tennessee. Does anybody know where Dyersburg, Tennessee is? Okay, so some of you know where that is. But I was not a Christian in Dyersburg, Tennessee. I tell people I'm from Dyersburg, and they say, oh, do you know Brother so-and-so at this? I know nothing about the church in Dyer County. I then went to UT Martin. I was converted there. I know something about the church in Weakley County, which is where Martin is, but not a lot. Because I was a young Christian. I was only a Christian there for a couple of years. I then went to the Memphis School of Preaching, and I was busy preaching on Sundays and stuff in various places. So I don't know a lot about the church in Shelby County. Everything I know about the church, I know about the church at Warren County. This is, to me, what the church is, right? Now, I've preached gospel meetings in lots of places, from Providence, Rhode Island to Chicago, so I know that not every county looks like this one, in the sense that, there's a VBS every week, all summer long, and there's congregations doing something all the time. There's 45 congregations in the county. I know that not every county looks like this one. I've been overseas to India and the Philippines. It doesn't look like it does here, right? I recognize that. But there's something unique about the churches of Christ in Warren County. And we're going to spend some time talking about how that came to be and why that is. And that's what we're going to do in this first session, which brings me to what we're going to talk about today. So what we're going to do is we're going to break it into really 2 sessions. And the second session might have 2 parts, okay? The first session is going to be the layers of what I see this discussion looking like. And we're going to talk about 4 layers, okay? As we think about those 4 layers, we're going to talk about the historical layer. That is, how did the Church of Christ in Warren County come to be? Number 2, we're going to talk about the philosophical layer, kind of a doctrinal layer, like what is the church, and how does that apply to the Church of Christ in Warren County? Then an individual layer, sort of a cross-section of the various congregations that we have here, just generally. And then aspirational layer, what do we want to be? Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about this morning. So what about the historical layer? First of all, does anybody recognize this building? That's Old Philadelphia. That's a vector rendering. I went to ChatGPT. The only time I'll use AI in sermon material is for pictures, right? I would never recommend using artificial intelligence to actually create your sermons. I get advertisements for that all the time. I think, it turns my stomach that somebody would use artificial intelligence to create a sermon. But for backgrounds, it's not a bad thing. So I gave an actual picture of Old Philadelphia, and it came with a vector rendering, which I can manipulate better and cut out and do stuff like that with. So this is Old Philadelphia. I chose this as the background for a really important reason. Because this is sort of the epicenter. Now, for years, I have said, I don't think that having 45 congregations in one county is good. I've said that for years. I began preaching at the Hebron Church of Christ in Irving College, and there's Hebron. About 2 miles up the road, there's Armstrong. About 2 miles up the road, there's White's Chapel. You go across the highway up, it's been a while since I've been up Hills Creek, and there's St. Mary's, right, over this way. And so you've got, and then there's Smyrna down here, right? And the first question that I ask is, why don't we all just get together, right? Why do we have so many congregations so spread out, and it seems like the work of the Lord is sort of inhibited by that? And then I thought, well, and I've said this before, Paul, Ephesus didn't have 20 congregations. It was just the congregation at Ephesus. But I don't know if that's the case. I've re-examined that. I don't know if that's the case. Look at Acts 20 and verse 20. Paul is to the church at Ephesus, he says this, "And how I kept back nothing from you that was profitable, but have showed you and have taught you publicly and from house to house." Many of the congregations in the first century met where? In their homes. Now, if you read commentaries, a lot of them are denominational, and they will say, well, the pastor, Paul here in this instance, who's not a pastor, that's a whole other discussion, okay? He not only preached at the congregations, but he went into people's homes. I don't think that's what this is saying. I think this is saying he went to these congregations in people's homes that were probably scattered around Ephesus, and he also preached publicly in larger gatherings. Think about gospel meetings or area-wide meetings that we might have. That's what I think this is talking about. I think I had it wrong in my view of what the church looked like in Ephesus. It wasn't one big congregation made up of 10,000 people or 3,000 people or 2,000 people. It was a bunch of home congregations, probably. That's what it looked like. It would have looked much more like Warren County than we maybe picture in our minds, right? If you'll flip through the pages of your New Testaments, when Paul writes these epistles, he says to the saints at Ephesus, not to the congregation at Ephesus, to the church of God which is at Corinth. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean it was one congregation. And so I had to adjust as I thought about that. You've got publicly there, which I think would be large public gatherings, and then you've got from house to house, which I think is the smaller dispersed assemblies within homes. And so I find that interesting. So maybe the first century church looked more like Warren County than we give it credit for. That's the first thing that I thought about when I thought about this. We see it again, Titus 1 and verse 5. I give credit to Bill Boyd. He's not in here. I told Brian this when I was thinking about the history of the Churches of Christ in Warren County. I said, you know who I need to call? Bill Boyd. And so I called Bill Boyd. And he texted me this a little bit later. He texted and emailed it to me, and it was the exact same wording. I don't know if he copy and pasted the email into a text or the text into an email, but he wanted to make sure I got this. And I studied this, and he's right. "For this cause, Paul tells Titus, I left thee in Crete, that thou shouldest set in order the things that are wanting, and ordain elders in every city." He made this point, and my study, I checked him just to verify. I trust Bill Boyd, but I'm not going to just say, Bill Boyd says. But Homer did say that Crete was the island of 100 cities. So that's probably a lot of smaller cities, and so maybe communities more than cities. Well, every community in Warren County has a church, doesn't it? You go to the Irving College community, there's 5 of them. You go to the Vervilla community or the Rockcliffe community or the Morrison community, and I think that might have been what Crete looked like. And Paul told Titus to ordain elders in every one of those places, which means there were congregations in every one of those places. And so that's really interesting, and that might lend credence to that same view. Now in Acts 14 and verse 23, it's described that Paul and his company ordained them elders in every church. They went to Lystra, Iconium, Antioch, just prior to that. And so maybe it looked a little bit different there. So I say all of that to say, maybe Warren County isn't that unusual in the sense of what the church might have looked like in the first century. And maybe I've not given them the credit that they deserved. And there are really some positives to having this many congregations in one place. And we'll talk about that as we move forward. So what about the churches in Warren County? It started where? It started at Old Philadelphia. This is David Lipscomb, and Bill Boyd turned me on to this quote, and I found it online in several places. Here's David Lipscomb, who was instrumental in the growth of the church in the late the early stages, not as early as Old Philadelphia, but the pretty early stages. Gospel advocate in the 1900s, did a great work in sort of unifying the teaching and instruction that would go on in congregations, especially rural congregations that didn't have large memberships. Here was David Lipscomb's philosophy. It has not been the policy of the South College Street Church to encourage the collecting of a large membership in one body. In other words, we don't want large, massive congregations. This, with a fine house, may flatter the preacher and attract numbers, but to scatter the large congregations into a number of worshiping bodies, and I misspelled worshiping, sorry, and leave them greatly to depend on themselves, will call out the activities, develop the talent, give practical experience to the religious lives of the masses of people, and give the most reliable class of religious people to be found in any community. Well, let's translate that. If you have a bunch of smaller congregations, more people will be able to be active and work than if you have one megachurch. Do you agree with that? I completely agree with that. Think about how many preachers we have here, both people who are formally trained and those who are maybe tent-making preachers, as we would say, who are part-time preachers or who are self-trained, self-taught, who would never be preaching if it weren't for the opportunities they have because of the many congregations. Think about people who teach Bible classes who would just hide in a megachurch, right? The people who are forced to be involved because of the smaller nature of the congregations. That was David Lipscomb's philosophy. And that might have played a role in why we have so many congregations in Warren County. Because that was sort of the philosophical approach, right? So, yes?
You think, too, back in those days, in 1805, 1830, early, late 1830s, they didn't jump in their car and go somewhere. They had a horse and buggy. Mm-hmm. They stayed part within their community.
And I think that's part of it absolutely as well. So I think there are two factors at work. I think number one, just from a practical standpoint, I mean, if the creek rises, you can't go anywhere anyway, right? And in the old days, and so you had to be more community-minded, right? And everything was, you had a general store in a community and you had a church, right? And those are things you had in every community. And I think, but also there's this intentional mindset that even in cities where you could travel from place to place, we don't want one big congregation. We want several smaller congregations. Because, and I think also in David Lipscomb's view, it emphasized faithfulness a little bit more too, because the more people you had, the more potential for problems if things went sideways. So I think there's all of that lends itself to the history here. Now, concerning the Church of Christ in Warren County specifically, began at the Old Philadelphia Church in Vervilla around 1810 is when they began to formally meet according to most records. Now, why is that date 1810 important? It's before whom? It's 15 years before Alexander and Thomas Campbell, roughly. You ever been called a Campbellite? The Church of Christ was active before Alexander and Thomas Campbell ever thought about doing the work that they were doing officially. So this has nothing to do with Campbell's doctrine. This has to do with the establishment, the reinstitution of New Testament Christianity. What you had in Old Philadelphia Church, you had a group of people who didn't have a preacher, and they opened up their Bibles and they said, here's what we want to be. And so they established a congregation in the Vervilla community that was doing only what the Bible said, and doing Bible things in Bible ways, calling Bible things by Bible names. That's what it was. Okay? In the same time that this was happening in Virginia, North Carolina, and other places, separate and apart from any historical movement, this was people going back to the Bible. And so that's really the seed that began this in Warren County. In 1818, there's a letter recommending a member from Old Philadelphia to another congregation in Alabama, which means the church was active and established by 1818. Okay, so that's historical record. From Old Philadelphia, you have the Ivy Bluff congregation. It's pretty old as well. 1825, I didn't realize that it was one of the older congregations in the county. Smyrna in Irving College. I didn't realize it was one of the older congregations in the county either. John Myers, I think, and the Myers family name is still very prominent in Irving College. So these are among the oldest congregations in Warren County. By 1870, there were 10 congregations with roughly 850 members. Among those are the McMinnville Church of Christ. I don't know where that is. That Central? I'm not really sure. Old Philadelphia, Abbey Bluff, Salem, which has just opened its doors again. Mount Zion, Smyrna, St. Mary's, Hebron. Notice 3 in the Irving College community alone. St. Mary's, Hebron, Center, and Dark Hollow. Now, those last 4 in particular, and I know this about Hebron, they originally had buildings that were shared with denominations. And so you would meet either one time of the day and another group come another time of day, or you would alternate Sundays. Hebron did that, I know, in particular, until they got their own building, because they just didn't have a building. So it was like a community building that different religious groups would meet in, and the church was among those. So by 1870, it's pretty well established. Now, what about the philosophical layer? What do we need to understand about the nature of the church, regardless of where you are, and how does that apply to the churches in Warren County? The philosophy of the church in Warren County needs to be the philosophy of God's Word, right? I think we can all agree on that. That's the only philosophy that matters. It doesn't matter what new church approach has come down the pike. People talk about church building, they talk about growing the church, they talk about having this program or that program or doing this thing or that thing. You know what the best way is to grow the church? Do things based on the way the Bible tells us to do them. That's the philosophy that we need. There is one church, Ephesians 4:4-6. One body and one spirit, even as you're called, in one hope of your calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all. So there's one church. It's the body of Christ. Christ is the head. We are the members. But there's one church, but there's many congregations, right? And those many congregations are autonomous. They work together, but they exist separately. Now, the beauty of that is, if heaven forbid something goes wrong here at Rockcliffe, it doesn't have to affect Morrison. Or it doesn't have to affect Bonner or whatever, you name it, the congregation, right? Each congregation stands and falls on its own merits. Revelation 2 and 3 makes that apparent, right? Jesus wrote an epistle to the church at Ephesus, the church at Pergamos, the church at Thyatira. And so each congregation stood on its own merits before God. We don't have some hierarchy where there's a supreme pope or guy in charge, and then other guys in charge, and then other people in charge. It's not a hierarchical situation. Each congregation stands on its own merit. And unity needs to be based on doctrine and practice. Bill Boyd is huge in emphasizing unity within the body of Christ, and for very good reason. We need to be unified. We need to work together. The passport idea in the VBSs is really amazing, I think. Y'all got your passports full, you got them stamped, right? That's just one symbol of unity within the churches of Christ here, right? We can go to VBSs in various places. Now, I've never been anywhere else. I just told you that. So I don't know if it's different elsewhere. But Bill says he was recently in Indiana. It didn't look like this, right? That not all congregations work together the way that the churches in Warren County work together. But unity is based on doctrine and practice. It's not based on what we feel are unity and diversity or whatever somebody says. 1 Corinthians 1:10 says what? There should be no divisions among you, but that you should be perfectly joined together in the same mind and in the same judgment. That's unity. No divisions, that you all speak the same things. He goes on to say, some say, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, I'm of Cephas, I'm of Christ. And then he has this rhetorical question that he asks. Is Christ divided? What's the answer? No, Christ is not divided. So unity needs to be based on doctrine and practice. And so in the congregations in Warren County, generally that's the case. We are generally unified on doctrine and practice. There is one church, but there are many congregations. That's the philosophy that we should apply, and I think that we do. Now we need to remember, Jesus determines who's in the church. Is that true? I just read a post from the Grundy Street congregation, and the preacher there studied with a lady who wanted to join the church. And the first thing he had to say is, you don't join the church, right? The Lord adds you to the church, Acts 2, verse 47. So he determines whether we're in the church, But that's not only true of individuals. Go to Revelation chapter 2. Somebody read Revelation 2:5 for us, please. Revelation 2:5. Who's going to do the removing of the candlestick or the lampstand? Jesus. Do I determine whether a congregation is in Christ or not? I mean, I can judge fruit, right? I can be a fruit inspector. Okay, I can absolutely do that. But here's what that means, and there's two sides of the coin. Number one, from a corrective standpoint, not just any group can claim to be the church, right? If we're not worshiping or practicing properly, and we change the name on the sign, does that affect who we are? No, it doesn't affect who we are, right? Either we are or we aren't, but Jesus determines that, right? And if I'm not worshiping and practicing properly, there are religious groups here who have tacked Church of Christ on the end of their name. Have you seen those? There are denominations with Church of Christ at the end of the denominational name. That doesn't change. The name does not change who we are or aren't. Now, we need to have a scriptural name, but that name doesn't magically make us one of Christ's. Our practice and doctrine make us one of Christ's. Okay, so that's the corrective side of it. But from the positive side of it, we can be an imperfect congregation and still be in Christ. Is that true? Can there be problems within a congregation and that congregation still be in Christ? Yes. They told us this when we graduated preaching school. If you're looking for a perfect congregation, you'll mess it up when you get there. All right? Because you're not perfect, right? So even if you find the perfect congregation, you're going to mess it up, they say. And they're absolutely right. If you're searching Warren County for the perfect congregation, you're going to look until you're blue in the face. You're not going to find it. The fact that Jesus determines who's in Christ and who's not, who's lampstand. Read about the churches in Revelation. Some of them had serious issues. Corinth had serious issues, but they were still the church, right? They were the church with serious issues that had to be addressed. As we look around the county, I guarantee there are congregations with serious issues. Maybe the congregations that we're members of have issues, but it's still the church. And we can still do our best to try to help one another get to heaven. That's the goal. Okay. So I wanted to sort of, from a philosophical layer, let's look at the churches of Christ in Warren County and let's say, okay, Jesus determines who is and isn't, and we need to work together and we need to try to diagnose the problems and fix them. If that's the case, then I think we can all be on the same page. We good so far? Historical layer, philosophical layer. All right, let's get a little more specific here. What about the individual layer? As we look at congregations within Warren County, what kind of variations do you see? Okay, size. As we think about congregations, there are congregations of all sizes. I remember in West Tennessee, I preached at a congregation that had 12 people, 12 members regularly. Their youth group consisted of people who were under 70. They joked about that. But one of the song leader was in his 80s, but I'll never forget. The mice must have aged with the congregation because a fellow was sitting on the front pew as I was preaching, and a mouse was along right about here. And that fella, that older gentleman, got up and he caught that mouse. I don't know if he and the mouse were roughly the same age or what the circumstances were, but he managed to catch that mouse, and I was really impressed. That was the Cloverdale congregation in the Reelfoot Lake area, in the Lake County. That congregation was 12 to 15 strong, but they supported preacher students. And you went there and you preached, and you got to hone your skills, and with people who were really supportive but couldn't hear you. And so it didn't really matter how you did. Now, there are congregations that are large, extremely large. And what is a large congregation anyway? Is 150 large? Is 200 large? Is 300 large? Is 500 large? What is large? Well, that's relative, isn't it? That's a relative term. There are places in this country where you could go and 75 would be a large congregation. There are places you could do mission work where 75 would be an outstanding number, a large congregation. And so, that's a relative term, but there are definitely variations in size in Warren County. Do congregations have personalities? They absolutely do. I've preached for 2 congregations full-time, Hebron and Morrison. Hebron was a membership of around 120, made up of probably 3 families at their core. Now, there are other people there too, but 3 families. That congregation fellowships better than any congregation I've ever been a part of. They love to be around each other. So that congregation has a personality like that. I mean, if you have a meal, they're going to fill up the place, right? They go camping together. They do all this stuff together, right? That fellowship, they've got it down pat. And that's not to say they don't have their issues. But fellowship is certainly not one of the problems that they have. That's their personality. Not all congregations have that personality. Some congregations are more metropolitan. It seems like people they interact differently. It depends on the leadership. It depends on the members. It depends on the community. I had a friend who preached in the suburbs of Atlanta. It was a relatively small congregation that should have been really close-knit, but he said the moment the last amen was said, because they were city folk, right? They were used to just going 100 miles a minute, doing their own thing. They didn't really have the mindset of let's slow down and let's be together and let's enjoy one another's company. They didn't operate that way. And he struggled with that. But that was the personality of the congregation. So there are differences in size, differences in personality. What else? I've got one more. What might you have? Okay, location, and we'll talk about that, I think, a little bit later. One I thought about was stability. A congregation that goes through a couple of preachers in 3 or 4 years is going to have some trouble sometimes, right? A congregation where one of the elders dies and the eldership dissolves. That congregation is going to go through maybe some difficult months or years, right? Maybe something else happens. Maybe there's a natural disaster and the building is affected. I've seen that happen before. Maybe, a notable member leaves or dies and it affects things, right? Congregations are at varying levels of stability. Some are as consistent as night and day, right? And they're always the same. They have such a stable leadership, such a stable history that things just kind of move steady. But then there are congregations that look like an EEG machine or something, and it depends. There was a congregation in did I say that wrong? EKG machine. I get hooked up to them all the time, but I don't know what to call. There's a congregation in West Tennessee where their personality and their stability, depended upon the preacher in the pulpit. I'm going to say I don't think that should ever be the case. The preacher should not determine the mindset of a congregation. Now, they can help communicate that. They are the mouthpiece of the eldership. I think the members, and particularly the eldership, needs to determine what a congregation is and its path. That needs to be the case. But congregations, maybe they don't have elders, and maybe that's causing instability. Or maybe a congregation is super stable as they are. There are lots of different variations of stability level, of personality, of size. Now, having this many different congregations in Warren County definitely has its benefits. Number one, you've got resources. If you are a missionary, come to Warren County. You'll have plenty of places to preach to and try to get support, right? If I have friends who enter into mission work and I say, hey, come on out. We'll try to set you up some places to come and talk to, give a report, talk to the elders. The chances are decent that whether on an individual level or on a congregational level, you're going to find some support because there are so many congregations. But not just that. The churches in Warren County, many come together, they support a counselor. We have a professional counselor on staff that the churches in Warren County, several of them get together and they support. I mean, these are things that maybe you can't do if you don't have so many congregations, right? There are so many resources here that I think are positive. Networking. If you want somebody to do some contracting work for you, can you find a member of the church to do that? Well, if you can't, in Warren County, that's a problem, right? You need somebody to put an air conditioner in, you can probably find a member of the church for that, right? You need somebody, X, Y, and Z. The chances are good, if you want to find somebody that you think you can depend on because they're a member of the church, you can find that, right? That's a big part of the community in this area. Spiritual support. Man, whenever, I'll remember, so many of you maybe are familiar with the fact that I had a heart episode years ago now. It's been, Jordan's 19 years old, so it's been 19 years ago. And, at the time, I had been here 4 years or so, roughly. So I was pretty established, but it's not like I'd been here 2 decades. But I've still got a book of all the people who came and visited while I was at Vanderbilt. And it's filled with members of various congregations in Warren County. Some of whom I knew, many of whom I didn't. The way that the church comes together in times of spiritual need is pretty amazing. And you don't get that everywhere. Travel out west, and you find one congregation every few hours, right? And that congregation might be 30 members, and they're isolated, and they don't have that support system. In Warren County, we really, really do have that. And so that's a really positive thing, I think. That's not to say, though, that having this many congregations in Warren County can't be a problem and can't present challenges. What challenges come when you have this many congregations in Warren County? It's funny you say that, the first one there, church hopping, right? Now, if a person says, I can't worship here properly, for whatever reason. This happened to me as a young man, so I am absolutely not being critical at all. A young man is dating a young lady, attending a congregation, and they break up. Poor fella. What's he going to do? Especially if he doesn't know anybody there. There's one young man, this happened to me as a young man too in college. I started attending with an elder's daughter. I'm dating her. I'm converted. The only person I know, the only people I know in the whole church is this lady and her family. And we break up. I don't feel comfortable there anymore. What am I supposed to do, right? And so I found another place to worship. There's nothing wrong with that. Maybe this congregation, we have lots of kids. We feel like we can be better served at another place. I dealt with both sides of that. Dealt with one side of it at Hebron and another side of it at Morrison. I understand those issues. But what really I think is a challenge, I don't conduct myself properly here. And I'm confronted about it, so I just move here where nobody knows about those issues. And I can skirt confronting my own spiritual demons, so to speak, by going from one congregation to another. And it's hard to be an elder in those circumstances and try to properly shepherd your flock. Because if you try to convince somebody to change their lives, well, they can just go down the road or they can go across county. And maybe people don't know the circumstances or maybe they don't care as much about that. And so that's to me where church hopping really becomes an issue. When you talk about people choosing how they're going to live their lives and choosing where they're going to worship based on sort of the comfort level of that sort of thing. And that can be a big issue. Number 2, churches should not be in competition with one another, should we? Absolutely not. But inevitably, members might try to recruit. I sure hope no preachers do, but maybe preachers would try to recruit and say, you need to go from this congregation to this congregation. That should not be how we operate. Under no circumstances should we behave that way. The church is not in competition with itself. It's one church, many congregations, right? If that's true, if that's the philosophy, then the church should not be in competition with itself. But sometimes it seems like that's the way that it ends up being. And it should not, it ought not be that way. Several have talked about this over the years that I've been here. Saturation. I've heard it said this way, you're either a member of the church or you are biased against the church in Warren County, Tennessee. That's how some people see it. Now, I don't believe that that's necessarily the case. There is plenty of good soil in Warren County, Tennessee. Plenty of hearts who need to hear the gospel of Christ. But my wife grew up in a denomination that actively taught against the church. Taught against the churches of Christ. Framed it as if the Church of Christ was a cult. So that sort of animosity towards the church, you don't get in places where it's not as prominent, right? You go out west, for instance, where there's one small congregation, it's probably not a blip on the denominational radar, right? And so they can operate in a way. I've gone to places where you say, I'm a member of the Church of Christ, and they say, what is that? I don't know that anybody would say that. Very few people who are in Warren County for very long would say that. And so some have said saturation. I don't know that that's the case, but I do know that maybe it's a challenge in a different way here than it might be in other places. And I think this might be the biggest one. The more prominent something is, the more likely we are to take it for granted. Imagine if there were one congregation within hours and you had to travel an hour, hour and a half to get there. Might it be the case that you appreciated assembling more? I think so. If you hardly knew anybody else besides those you worshiped with who were members of the church, might it be something you appreciated a little more and were more willing to talk about with others even? You see, it's such a prominent part of this county that it's almost a given and we take it for granted, right? And we shouldn't do that. We should never take for granted the opportunity to do the things that we do here. Being somebody who only really knows about the church in Warren County for the reasons I told you earlier, it's easy to do, right? Because I don't have a frame of reference for a situation where the church isn't this prominent. Some of you may. And if you do, then maybe you appreciate it a little bit more than the rest of us. But these are all challenges that come when a place is saturated in the way that maybe we are saturated. So, any other things you'd like to add to any of the things we've talked about on an individual layer? I wanted to be very general, but I think we've hit, most of the congregations in terms of just a general, sketch. Anything else? Aspirational level. By aspirational level, what I mean is, what do we aspire to be? What does the church in Warren County aspire to be? I wonder when the last time is we stop to think about that. How often do the elderships of the congregations in Warren County stop to say, what do we want the church to look like in our community? What do we want to be? I hope we do that a lot. But do we? Collectively, does the church say, what do we want to be? What do we want to look like? What do we aspire to? I was talking to my wife, and my wife, I want to say she retired, but she calls it quitiring because she could not fully retire, so she just quit, but she's done for good. So she retired. So she made a new word, quitired, from teaching, and in particular from administration. And she says one of her jobs as an administrator was to do evaluations. And so she's a trained teacher evaluator. And every few years, a new evaluation method comes down the pike. If you're in education, you know that. And it's really all the same with different labels, right? It's like if you go to the mayonnaise section of the grocery store and you've got the Kroger brand or the Blue Plate brand, and what you don't know is that some of those private label brands are actually made by the name brand company, right? And so you're eating the same mayonnaise in a different jar, right? Same stuff. Same with gasoline. Yeah, you see the Raceway truck go to Shell. I've got one of my best friends says, I'm only getting name brand gas. And he will only go to Shell or Amoco. Does Amoco even exist anymore? Or, those places that are name brand. I'm like, give me the cheapest gas possible because it's all coming from the same place, right? Same place. But one of the things that she said as I was talking to her is the big push now in evaluation is to sort of approach it from this standpoint. What minor change could we make that has the potential for the biggest impact? What minor change can we make that might have the biggest impact? Let me give you a few examples at Morrison. And Morrison is certainly not perfect. We've got lots of areas to work on, and I'm going to share some of that with you maybe as we go into the next session. But as we grew and as people came in who didn't know each other, one of the concerns was that we weren't as friendly as we needed to be, right? Okay, so what do we do about that? Well, I went to polishing the pulpit, and there was an entire lesson on door greeter programs, on really being more welcoming, right? One of the things was, what about door greeters? Who welcomes them as they come in? So one of our deacons said, let's start a door greeter program. I think it's done wonders at Morrison. I think because what we would see is somebody would come and visit, they wouldn't know where to take their kids for Bible class. Where do I go? Okay, what am I supposed to do now? What classes are there for adults? And they would, that's the first, where's the bathrooms? They wouldn't know those questions, right? They answer those questions. So now there's somebody designated, there are several somebodies designated to be the first line of defense, so to speak, for a new visitor, right? And it's a rotational thing, and you go and you're friendly, and that you make contact with people, right? That's paid dividends, but the thing, that's not a major thing. It's not a huge deal. It's not like we scraped up the parking lot or something like that. We didn't change the layout of the building. We just put people at the front door. That's not a huge deal, right? Minor changes that have the potential for major impact. Maybe that's because I think what we do is we say, it's like we do at home. There's this room back here that's a mess. I don't know where to start, so we just never address it, right? Because we don't know where to start. Well, maybe if you just go in there and do the smallest thing, right? Just start somewhere, right? Minor changes that have the potential for major impact. So as we get into the next session, which is going to talk about some more specific things, I want you to keep that in the back of your mind. Maybe there are major issues in congregations. But maybe if we start with minor changes, we can address some of those major issues. Because just like in our homes, sometimes in the church, there's this issue and we don't know how to address it, so we just don't do anything. And we hope it goes away. It is never a good medical approach to say, I've got this festering wound, I'm just going to ignore it and hope that it goes away. That's likely not going to happen. We men like to do that, don't we? It'll just go away on its own. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. I spoke in a VBS the other night, and I had been doing some work on our deck outside, and I had a single mark here with a perfect circle around it. I thought, ooh, that's a spider bite, possibly. It's either a spider bite or a screw puncture wound. It's one of those two things. One of those is not really that big of a deal. The puncture wound, the other one might be. So what did they tell me to do? Draw a circle around it, right? So, to see if it grows. And so that's what I did. The only thing is, while I was teaching, I was using my hands, and did he get a tattoo of a bullseye on his forearm? What's going on here? No, it was me having, I thought, I'm trying to be a responsible man and try to, take care of myself, right? But I forgot to tell him that, hey, that's not a tattoo on my forearm there. Anyway, the point is, we need to pay attention to what's going on around us, right? We need to pay attention to our congregations, and we need to see if we can start with minor changes, minor tweaks that can have major impacts. And then we go from minor to major and see if we can fix the problems that are prominent in all of the congregations that you and I are connected with and feel very strongly about. So, that's the first session. Any questions? Any comments? I love the church in Warren County. I've come to love the members here and have been a part of many congregations in many aspects. I really appreciate the community that exists within the church. When we come back, here's what we're going to do. We're going to look at, sounds daunting, but it's not. We're going to look at each of Paul's epistles, and we're going to boil it down to just a couple of questions. Direct questions that we can ask about the congregations where we worship and serve. Okay? Because Paul's epistle to the congregations really is Paul's epistle to the church in Warren County, isn't it? Because Paul said to the Colossians, hey, give that to the Laodiceans. Hey, Laodiceans, you give that to the Colossians. These are universal ideas that we can all apply to every one of our congregations and lives. So that's what we'll do when we come back.